This week, I wanted to really talk about the power of understanding our emotions as leaders. I was recently listening to the 10% Happier podcast, which is a great podcast, by the way, on meditation and things like that. And in it, they were actually doing one of their best ofs, and it was an interview with Brene Brown about her latest book, Atlas of the Heart. And in it, she mapped the 87 different key emotions that we tend to experience as humans. One of the things that I found fascinating was the number of emotions that we usually recognize. So I'm curious, can you guess how many emotions we usually recognize as humans? My initial guess was 10. Turns out that the real answer is 3. Most of us can only identify 3 emotions: sad, glad, and pissed off. And why is this so important, right? Well, the key is that there's real power in the words and language we use. And if we're limited by our language, it can actually impact us and hold us back. And I see this in my own life. From a young age, whenever I was asked, "How are you doing?" my go-to response, without even thinking about it, was, "Oh, I'm doing good. How are you?" I actually used to have one of my exes actually teased me about this because I would say I'm good, even if I was feeling awful. And it was part of my people pleasing upbringing, right? I wasn't supposed to identify my emotions, right? I wasn't supposed to burden others. So I'm always supposed to be feeling good. But as leaders, there's a lot of power in understanding what emotions we're feeling and being able to have a vocabulary. That way, we aren't spreading negativity. It can actually help us build trust and vulnerability and make our teams more motivated and higher performing. And like I was saying, language really matters. And I think one of the best examples that Brene actually brought up was the difference between the words stress and overwhelm. And, so often I hear myself saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm feeling so overwhelmed today." And especially as women, we have a lot going on in our world. And hey, we can sometimes get overwhelmed. But the thing is, when we say that, are we actually overwhelmed? Because the big difference between stress and overwhelm is, can we handle what's going on around us or not? When you're stressed, you actually may have a ton of stuff to deal with. And I'm not saying it's not going to feel hard. It can be hard, but you actually know how to handle it and you know that next step. When you're actually in overwhelm, the only solution is nothingness. It is to give ourselves rest. So often we try to work through overwhelm by trying to plan, figure out the next step. But when we are truly in overwhelm, what our bodies are saying is they need space. So next time, you might say, "Oh, I'm feeling so stressed out," or "I'm really overwhelmed." Take a minute to pause. If you say, I'm really overwhelmed," are you actually overwhelmed? And if you are, then give yourself the space to do nothing for 15 minutes. And I really mean do nothing, not like doom scrolling on social media. That does not help. Go for a nice, lovely walk outside instead. But if you feel you can handle those current challenges, then reframe the statement and say, "I'm not overwhelmed. I am stressed, but I'm going to do whatever XYZ is that you're going to do to address it." And it's so important that we realize as leaders how we're feeling and have the right language for sharing. Because when we share how we're feeling and can communicate how that's impacting our work, we can actually enable more collaboration and empathy in our teams. And it also really helps us regulate our emotions. Again, when we're going through those difficult emotions like stress or anger or frustration, we need to learn which emotion we're feeling, how we can process those emotions and actually feel them in our bodies. And then giving ourselves the opportunity to either take action or let it go. And after you've done that, then you can communicate to your team potentially about these if it's still going to be impacting your work. The important thing is not to be doing this from a place of fight or flight, which is the place we so often get into, especially when we're having some negative emotions. And so it's really important to understand our emotional triggers because we could be hijacked by our emotions. And then when that happens, the emotions can actually be contagious. How often have you been exuding stress and frustration and you realize your entire team's now gotten stressed out because of you? That is not being an impactful and effective leader. Emotions also are ultimately how we build connection. And as leaders, a huge part of our role is to enable effective collaboration in our teams. And so a great team building activity can actually be to coach your team on understanding their own emotions and sharing them effectively. It would help them, even in their own personal lives, to understand more than the three emotions. So you're helping them not just as work, but as a whole human being as well. And by doing this, you can build empathy, vulnerability, and trust amongst your team. And guess what? That leads to happier, more motivated, high-performing teams. And, I'm a highly empathetic person, and I used to actually pride myself on the ability to read other people's emotions. Now, I kind of got in trouble about this when I was listening to Brene, though, because one of the things she mentions in her research is we can't actually read others' emotions because the outward expression of different emotions overlaps, right? And therefore, we can't actually predict which emotion is being shared. Frustration, anger, shame, resentment can actually physically show up the same way. She gave a great example from the movie Chef, which is a great movie. It's one of my favorites if you haven't watched it. And the main actor is a chef, and he just got a bad review from a food critic because he wanted to be cooking his food, but the restaurant owner was making him cook the same stuff day in and day out. And the food critic gave him a pretty bad review. And the main actor is literally screaming about the moltenness of chocolate. Honestly, if you haven't watched it, definitely, it's great. And I personally thought he was most likely feeling shame, but other people who were watching it with me said, hey, they might be having anger or frustration. So you can't ultimately identify exactly what emotion somebody is feeling. So instead of trying to read others' emotions, it's about developing this vocabulary so that we can ask them how they're truly feeling. Here's the key part. It's about believing what they say. And I'm going to repeat myself here because this is the gold in today's LinkedIn Live for you. If you remember one thing out of today, this is it. Instead of trying to read others' emotions, we should ask them how they are truly feeling and believe what they say. This is what inclusion and creating an inclusive environment is actually about. So often, women and underrepresented minorities are not believed when they share their experiences and how they truly feel. Have you ever felt like somebody didn't believe you, right? If we want to be building these true connections and getting the best work out of our team, ultimately, it's about believing the emotions and stories that they share. And, as I mentioned, I listened to the podcast, and one of the things that she mentioned is that there's actually a great 6-part documentary on HBO based on the book Atlas of the Heart. So I'm actually going to start watching it. And if anybody else does, definitely let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts as well.